on the loneliest island in all the world. A single speck of green in the vast emptiness of the Pacific Ocean, more than 1,000 miles from the nearest inhabited land. There stand nearly 1,000 giant stone figures, carved in the shape of human faces, some as tall as a house and heavier than 100 people, gazing out in solemn silence. They were carved and moved for miles and raised upright by a people who had no metal, no wheels, no draft animals of any kind. And then, one by one, that same people pulled every last one of them down. How did anyone ever find this island, so impossibly far from everything? How did they carve and move and lift these colossal stone giants with nothing but stone tools and rope and muscle? Why did they make so many? And then, at the height of it all, why did they stop and topple their own great works into the dust? These are among the deepest riddles in all of human history, and behind them lies the story of one of the most remarkable and most misunderstood civilizations the world has ever seen. Good evening and welcome. Tonight, let me take you gently across the great dark ocean to that far and lonely island, to Rapa Nui, which we call Easter Island, and to the people who raised the silent stone giants and then let them fall. Come with me, slowly over thousands of miles of empty sea, to a green speck at the edge of the world, and to one of the strangest and most haunting stories our species has ever lived. Picture it. A small triangular island of grassy volcanic hills, rimmed with black cliffs and blue surf, utterly alone in an ocean so vast that from its shores there is nothing to see, in any direction, but water to the horizon and beyond. No other land, no other lights, no other people, for more than 2,000 miles. It is, quite simply, the most remote inhabited place on the face of the earth. And yet, more than 1,000 years ago, human beings found it, crossed that impossible emptiness in open canoes, guided only by the stars and the swell and the birds, and made their home on this tiny lost island at the end of the world. And there, in complete isolation, cut off from all the rest of humanity, they built a civilization all their own, and carved, out of the volcano itself, the great stone ancestors that still gaze out across the grass today. Tonight we are going to follow their whole story, slowly, from the very beginning to the very end. We will sail with the first voyagers across the trackless ocean to find the island. We will watch their society grow and divide into clans and raise the great stone platforms along the shore. And we will go to the quarry in the side of the volcano, where the giants were carved, and where hundreds of them still lie, half-finished, exactly as the carvers left them. We will wrestle with the great mystery of how the statues were moved, for the island's own people said, simply, that the giants walked, and we will see how that strange old saying may hold the key to the puzzle. We will watch the Moai raised upright upon their platforms, crowned with great topknots of red stone, their eyes opened at last so that the ancestors might watch over the living. And then we will come to the great turning, to the vanishing of the island's forests, and the toppling of the giants, and the famous story that the Rapa Nui destroyed their own world and fell into ruin. But we will look at that story honestly and closely, because much of what we have long been told about the fall of Easter Island turns out to be wrong, and the truth is stranger and sadder, and in some ways more hopeful than the legend. We will meet the strange new faith of the birdman that rose after the age of the giants, and we will watch, at last, the first European ships appear on the horizon on an Easter Sunday 3 centuries ago, and the far greater catastrophe that came from beyond the sea and nearly wiped the Rapa Nui from the earth altogether. And we will end not with a vanished people, but with a living one, for against all the odds the Rapa Nui survived, and their descendants live on the island still, keeping the old language and the old memories, the children of the people who carved the giants. Theirs is not only a story of a great and mysterious rise and fall, but of an almost unbelievable endurance. It is a story of the boldest voyage in human history and the loneliest island on earth, of 1,000 stone ancestors carved and raised and thrown down, of an undeciphered script no one can read, and a collapse we have long misunderstood, and a people who would not be extinguished. It is one of the most haunting tales our species has ever told, and tonight we will tell all of it. Before we begin, I would love to know where you are tonight. Leave a comment and tell me the name of your town and what time it is where you are as you settle in. There is something quietly lovely in knowing that all around the world, others are lying in the dark, listening to this same old story under so many different skies. And if you would like to drift off like this again tomorrow night, you might gently tap subscribe. That way, each new story will quietly find its own way to you in the dark, without your ever having to go searching for it. But only if these journeys truly bring you rest. There is no need otherwise. Your peace tonight matters far more than any number. So there is nothing left to do now but let the day go. Let your shoulders grow heavy. Let the warmth settle into your hands and your jaw and the space behind your eyes. You do not have to remember any of this. You only have to listen and let the words carry you. Let your breathing slow. Let the sounds of the room drift away. Feel the soft ocean wind moving over the island grass, the endless hush of the surf on the black rocks, the great stone faces standing quiet in the dusk, and the enormous starry sky of the southern ocean opening overhead, deeper and wider than any sky you have ever seen. We are going back now. Far back. Past the ships and the sorrow, to the age when the island was young and green, and further still, out onto the open ocean, to a handful of small canoes crossing the empty sea in search of a home, and the first slow beginning of the lost world of Rapa Nui. Let us begin, as their whole story must, with the sheer overwhelming loneliness of the place. Take a globe and find the vast blue emptiness of the South Pacific Ocean, the largest and emptiest expanse of water on the face of the earth, and somewhere in the middle of it, almost lost, a tiny triangular speck of land. That speck is Rapa Nui, and there is nothing else in any direction for thousands of miles. To grasp how alone it is, consider this. The nearest inhabited land is another small island, more than 1,000 miles away across the open sea. The nearest continent is farther still, some 2,000 miles of empty ocean to the east. If you stood on the shore of Rapa Nui and looked out, you would see only water curving away to the horizon, and know that beyond it lay only more water, farther than you could ever imagine. It is the most isolated inhabited island in all the world. The island itself is small, You could walk across it in a day, and it was made long ago by fire. 3 great volcanoes, long extinct, rose from the sea floor and joined to form the land, and their old craters still mark its corners, some cradling reed-fringed lakes of fresh water. Between them the land is gentle and grassy, rolling in green hills down to a coast of black volcanic cliffs where the surf beats endlessly against the rock. It is a place of wind and sky and sea. The great Pacific weather sweeps across it unbroken. The sun is strong. The nights are ablaze with the stars of the southern sky, more brilliant here, in the clean ocean air far from any other light than almost anywhere on Earth. It is beautiful in a stark and lonely way, a small green world afloat in an ocean of blue. But it was not an easy place to live. The island is small, and its soil, though volcanic and fertile in patches, is thin and easily worn. There is no coral reef, as on so many Pacific islands, to shelter a rich harvest of fish. The rain sinks quickly through the porous rock, so fresh water is precious. And, being so utterly remote, the island had few of the plants and animals that Pacific voyagers usually relied upon. Whoever came here would have to work hard and cleverly to survive. And yet the island was not always as bare as it looks today. For when the first people came, Rapa Nui was covered, we now know from the pollen buried in its lake beds, with a great forest, dominated by a giant palm, tall and thick, unlike anything growing there now. The grassy, treeless island the world knows today is not the island the first settlers found. They found a green and wooded world, and what became of that forest is one of the great questions of our whole story. So picture the island as it was at the very beginning, before any human foot had touched it. A small triangular land of volcanic hills, cloaked in a dense palm forest, ringed with black cliffs and blue surf, alive with seabirds nesting in their millions on its untouched shores, and utterly, perfectly empty of people, afloat and alone in the vast Pacific, waiting, as it had waited for ages, for someone to find it. For it is worth pausing on that emptiness and that silence. For most of the history of the earth, this island simply sat there, unknown and unvisited, its forest growing and its birds nesting and its surf beating, while the great story of humankind unfolded, all unknowing, thousands of miles away. No one knew it was there. No one could know. It was one of the last empty places on Earth. And that raises the first and perhaps the greatest mystery of Rapa Nui, greater, even, than the giants. How did anyone ever find it at all? How did human beings, in an age before maps or compasses or ships as we know them, cross thousands of miles of trackless, featureless open ocean, and stumble upon a speck of land so small and so remote that it seems a miracle anyone ever reached it, in the whole vast emptiness of the Pacific? The answer lies in one of the most extraordinary achievements of the human race, the great voyaging of the Polynesian peoples, the boldest sailors the world has ever known. To understand how anyone came to be standing on the loneliest island on Earth, we must go back and out onto the open ocean to the astonishing story of the people who conquered the Pacific. To the voyagers we now will turn. The people who found Rapa Nui were Polynesians, and the Polynesians were, quite simply, the greatest ocean voyagers in the history of humankind. Over many centuries, in an age when the peoples of Europe still hugged their coasts in fear of the open sea, the Polynesians deliberately sailed out into the largest ocean on Earth and found and settled nearly every scrap of habitable land in all its vast expanse. Think of the scale of it. The islands of the Pacific are scattered across an ocean that covers a third of the surface of the whole planet. Tiny specks of land separated by hundreds, often thousands, of miles of open water. And one by one, over the generations, the Polynesians found them all. A great triangle of ocean with its corners at Hawaii in the north, New Zealand in the southwest, and, at its farthest, loneliest eastern point, Rapa Nui itself. It is the largest area ever settled by a single people. And they did it in open canoes, great double-hulled voyaging canoes, two long hulls lashed together with a deck between, driven by sail and paddle, able to carry dozens of people, with their animals and plants and all they needed to found a new home. These were not rafts adrift on the current. They were true ocean-going ships, the product of centuries of accumulated skill, capable of crossing the widest seas. But the ships were the least of it. The true marvel was the navigation, for the Polynesians crossed those vast empty distances without any instrument of any kind. No compass, no map, no chart, nothing but the knowledge carried in the mind of the navigator. They steered by the stars, memorizing the rising and setting points of dozens of them, by the sun and the moon, by the direction and the feel of the great ocean swells, by the winds and the clouds and the flight of birds. A skilled Polynesian navigator could hold his course across 1,000 miles of open ocean, out of sight of any land for weeks, and know, by reading the sea and the sky, where he was and where the islands lay. He could detect the presence of land far over the horizon by the way the swells bent around it, by the clouds that gathered above it, by the seabirds that flew out from it to fish and home to it at dusk. It was a science of the ocean as deep and as real as any in the world, carried entirely in the memory and passed down by word of mouth. And these master voyagers pushed ever eastward across the Pacific, from island group to island group over the centuries, and at last some intrepid crew in a great canoe set out from the islands of central Polynesia into the empty Eastern Ocean, and sailed on, and on, farther than anyone had gone before, until at last, incredibly, they raised on the horizon the green volcanic hills of Rapa Nui, the loneliest island in the world, found at last. We do not know exactly when or precisely how, the date is still debated among scholars, but somewhere around 1,000 years ago, or perhaps a little less, the first canoe load of settlers made landfall on Rapa Nui and stepped ashore onto the empty forested island, and became the first human beings ever to set foot upon it. The Rapa Nui themselves remembered it in legend. A founding chief, Hotu Matue, the great parent, who led his people across the sea to their new home. Imagine that landfall, the great canoe, worn from its immense voyage, running at last onto a beach of the new island. The weary voyagers waiting ashore, the astonishment of it, to have crossed all that emptiness and found, against every odds, a green and living land. They had brought with them what they needed to build a world, their crops and their chickens and the knowledge and the customs of their people. And they set about making the empty island their home. And then, this is the crucial thing, the thing that shaped everything that followed. The door closed behind them. For Rapa Nui was so remote, so impossibly far from anywhere, that once the settlers had arrived, the voyages seemed to have stopped. There was no more coming and going, no more contact with the rest of Polynesia, no more canoes from home. The island was simply too far. The people of Rapa Nui were now alone, utterly, completely alone, cut off from all the rest of humankind. And in that absolute isolation, over the centuries that followed, they built a civilization entirely their own, a world that grew and developed in perfect separation from every other human society on Earth, following its own path, its own ideas, its own strange and magnificent obsessions. And out of that isolated world came the great stone giants. To the society that raised them we now will turn. Alone on their island at the edge of the world, the people of Rapa Nui multiplied and spread across the land and built their society. And though they had come from the wider Polynesian world and kept its language and its customs and its gods, they now developed in complete isolation, weaving those inheritances into something unique, a small, intense, inward-turned world entirely their own. They lived, at first, in the manner of their Polynesian ancestors, in villages along the coast, in houses of a distinctive shape, long and low and curved like an overturned canoe, thatched with reeds. They fished the waters around the island, though the lack of a sheltering reef made it hard. And, above all, they farmed, clearing the forest, planting the crops they had brought across the sea. The sweet potato, the taro, the yam, the banana, the sugar cane, and the paper mulberry tree from whose bark they made their cloth. And they kept the one animal they had carried with them across the ocean, the chicken. On an island with no pigs, no dogs, and few other sources of meat, the chicken was precious, and the people built great stone hen houses to shelter and protect their flocks. Long, low structures of piled stone that still stand today, a testament to how carefully this scarce resource was guarded. Over the generations, the population grew. Slowly at first, and then, as the people mastered their island, more quickly, until Rapa Nui held, at its height, many thousands of people, a substantial society crowded onto its small and finite land. And as the people multiplied, they organized themselves, as Polynesians did, into clans, great extended family groups, each descended from a common ancestor, each holding its own territory on the island. The island came to be divided, like a pie, into wedge-shaped territories, running from the central highlands down to the coast, one for each of the clans. Each clan had its own lands, its own coastal settlements, its own sacred sites, and each was led by its chiefs, the Ariki, who claimed descent from the founding ancestors, and who held a sacred authority over their people. At the top stood the paramount chief, the descendant of Hotu Matue himself, the sacred high chief of the whole island. And binding this whole society together was a worldview centered, above all, on the ancestors. For the Rapa Nui, like other Polynesians, believed that the world was charged with a sacred power they called mana, a spiritual force that flowed through chiefs and priests in sacred places and, above all, through the ancestors, the honored dead, who watched over their living descendants and could bless them with fertility and abundance and success. The dead, to the Rapa Nui, were not gone. they remained present and powerful and involved in the affairs of the living, a source of protection and blessing for the clan that honored them properly, and of danger for the clan that did not. To keep the goodwill of the ancestors, to honor them, to house their mana and channel their blessing, this was among the deepest concerns of Rapa Nui life. And it was out of this reverence for the ancestors that the great stone giants would, in time, be born. For consider the situation of this isolated people. They were alone on a small island in the middle of the vast ocean, with no other human beings anywhere in their world. The forces that mattered to them, the powers that could help or harm them, were not other nations or empires, for there were none, but the sacred powers of their own world. The gods, the mana, and above all the ancestors, the great chain of the honored dead reaching back to the founders who had crossed the sea. And so their whole spiritual energy, their whole immense creative genius, turned inward and upward, toward the honoring of those ancestors and the housing of their sacred power. A society that in another place might have poured its strength into war against its neighbors or trade across the sea, had no neighbors and no sea trade, and it poured that strength instead into stone, into the making of great monuments to the ancestors on a scale and with an intensity that the isolation of the island seems only to have deepened. It is one of the keys to the whole mystery of Rapa Nui that this was a world turned entirely in upon itself, a single small society alone in the ocean, with no outlet for its energies but its own island and its own beliefs. And in that pressure cooker of isolation, over the centuries, the ancestor worship of the Polynesians grew into something extraordinary, something found nowhere else on earth. The cult of the great stone giants, the Moai. For to honor their ancestors, the people of Rapa Nui built, along the shores of their island, great stone platforms. And upon those platforms they raised the colossal stone figures of the ancestors themselves, to gaze inland over the clan and its lands, and to pour out their blessing upon the living. To those platforms and those figures and the sacred purpose behind them we now will turn. All around the coast of Rapa Nui, the clans built great ceremonial platforms of stone, the Ahu, the sacred heart of Rapa Nui religion. There are hundreds of them, ringing the island, each belonging to a clan or a community, each a place of immense sacred importance, where the people gathered to honor their ancestors and their gods. An Ahu was a massive rectangular platform of stone, sometimes very large indeed. A long, raised, level terrace, faced with fitted stone, built up along the coast, usually with its back to the sea and its face to the land. In their construction, some of the finest Ahu show a skill in stone fitting that has astonished visitors, great blocks shaped and joined with a precision that recalls, to some eyes, the famous stonework of the Andes far across the ocean. The Ahu were, above all, sacred burial places and temples of the ancestors, the sites where the honored dead were laid, where the clan's most sacred rituals were performed, where the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the ancestors was thinnest. They were the spiritual center of the clan's whole world, the place where its identity and its sacred power were rooted in the land. And upon the Ahu the people raised the Moai, the great stone figures of the ancestors. For that is what the Moai were. Not gods exactly and not idols but images of the ancestors, the honored dead of the clan, made colossal in stone, and set up upon the sacred platform to embody the ancestors' continuing presence and his mana among his living descendants. And here is a detail of profound importance that unlocks the whole meaning of the giants. The Moai upon the Ahu do not face out to sea. They stand upon the platform with their backs to the ocean, and they gaze inland, in over the clan's lands, over its fields and its houses and its people. For they were set there to watch over the living, to look upon their descendants, and to pour out upon them the ancestral blessing, the manna, that made the crops grow and the people prosper. The giants were guardians, facing inward, watching over their own. Imagine standing in a clan's village in the great age of the Moai and looking up toward the Ahu on the rise above the settlement. The long stone platform, and upon it, in a row, the colossal figures of your own ancestors, your founding chiefs, your honored dead, made huge and eternal in stone, gazing down upon you, watching over you, their sacred power flowing out across the land that was theirs and was now yours. It must have been a profound and comforting and awe-inspiring thing. For the Moai embodied the unbroken bond between the living clan and its ancestors, the great chain of descent reaching back through the honored dead to the founders who had crossed the ocean. To raise a Moai was to make that bond visible and permanent, to set the ancestor, in stone, forever watching over his people, to root the clan's identity and its sacred power immovably in the sacred land. And so the raising of Moai became the central sacred work of Rapa Nui society, the great channel into which the whole creative and spiritual energy of this isolated people flowed. To honor the ancestors was the highest good. To raise a great Moai upon the clan's Ahu was the highest expression of that honor and the highest source of prestige. And over the centuries, the making of the giants grew into an obsession that would shape the whole island and the whole history of the Rapa Nui. It became, too, a matter of rivalry between the clans. For if the mana of a clan was shown in its Moai, in their number and their size and their splendor, then each clan had every reason to raise more and greater and finer statues than its neighbors, to outdo them in the honoring of the ancestors, and so in the sacred power and prestige of the clan. A great competition, in stone, seems to have grown up between the clans of the island, each straining to raise ever more and ever larger giants. And so, along the whole coast of Rapa Nui, over the generations, the Ahu grew, and the Moai rose upon them, in ever greater numbers and ever greater size. A whole island ringed with the colossal stone figures of the ancestors, gazing inland over their clans, in one of the most extraordinary displays of monumental art and sacred devotion anywhere in the human world. But what were they truly like, these stone giants? How large, how many, how made? Let us look at the Moai themselves, close up, in all their strange and solemn majesty, before we ask the greatest questions of all: how they were carved, and how they were moved, and how they were raised. To the giants themselves we now will turn. Let us look, then, at a Moai, one of the great stone giants of Rapa Nui, and take in its strange and unmistakable form. It is a single colossal figure, carved from volcanic stone, showing a human being from the hips up. A great head and torso, with a long straight nose, a firm jutting chin, thin tight lips, and deep, hollow, shadowed brows beneath a low forehead. The arms are held tight to the sides, the long fingers reaching across the belly. It gazes out with an expression of solemn, distant, unreadable dignity. They are enormous. A typical Moai stands as tall as 2 or 3 people and weighs many tons, and the largest that were actually raised and set upon their platforms are taller than a 2-story house and weigh as much as a heavy truck. Dozens upon dozens of tons of solid stone, carved and moved and lifted upright by human hands alone. To stand beneath one is to feel very small indeed. And there were many, so many. Across the island, nearly 1,000 Moai have been counted, in all their various states. Standing, fallen, finished, unfinished. Nearly 1,000 giant stone figures on an island you could walk across in a day. It is a staggering density of monumental sculpture, unmatched anywhere on Earth. The whole small island a single vast open-air gallery of the stone ancestors. Their style is remarkably consistent, for all were carved to the same basic form, refined over the generations, so that a Moai is instantly recognizable, one of the most distinctive images in all the world. And yet within that style there is variety. The giants grew larger over time, as the competition between the clans drove the carvers to ever greater feats. And here and there are unusual ones, a rare kneeling figure, differences of detail that hint at the long development of the art. Many of the Moai, when they stood complete upon their platforms, wore upon their heads a great cylinder of red stone, the pukeo, which we often call a topknot. Carved from a different reddish volcanic rock, quarried at a separate place, these huge red cylinders were hoisted up and set upon the giants' heads, adding still more height and weight and splendor, and perhaps representing the ancestors' hair, bound up in the manner of a Rapa Nui chief. And the giants had eyes. For a long time, no one realized it, for the eye sockets of the Moai stood empty. But it was discovered that, when a Moai was finally raised upon its ahu and dedicated, its eyes were set in place, made of white coral with a pupil of dark stone, and that only then, with its eyes opened, did the statue truly come alive and become the seeing, watching, sacred presence of the ancestor, gazing out with its shining coral eyes upon the living. Imagine a completed Moai in its full glory, in the great age of the giants. Raised upon its ahu above the shore, crowned with its great red topknot, its eyes of white coral and dark stone opened and gleaming, gazing solemnly inland over the clan and its land, embodying the living presence and the sacred power of the ancestor. It was not a mere statue. It was, to the people who made it, a holy and a living thing. And to make even one such giant, to carve it and move it for miles and raise it upright and crown it and open its eyes, was the work of a whole community, over a long time at enormous cost in labor and food and organization. To make nearly 1,000 of them on a small and isolated island was one of the most concentrated feats of monumental effort in the whole human story, a whole society bending its collective strength generation after generation to the raising of the stone ancestors. It raises, inevitably, the great practical questions, the ones that have puzzled and fascinated the world ever since the first outsiders saw the giants. How, without metal tools, were these colossal figures carved from the living rock? how, without wheels or draft animals, were they moved for miles across the island. And how, without cranes or machines of any kind, were they raised upright and crowned with their heavy topknots and set gazing out over the land. The answers begin in one place above all, the great quarry in the side of a volcano, where the giants were born and where hundreds of them still lie today, in every stage of making, exactly as the carvers left them when the work at last came to its end. To the quarry of Raraku, the birthplace of the giants, we now will go. Nearly all the great giants of Rapa Nui were born in a single place, the crater of a volcano called Raraku, whose slopes are made of a soft volcanic stone, a compressed volcanic ash perfect for carving. Here, on the flanks of this one mountain, generation after generation of carvers hewed the Moai from the living rock. And here, to this day, the quarry remains, one of the most extraordinary and haunting places on the face of the earth. For the quarry did not empty when the carving stopped. It froze. When the great age of the Moai came to its end, the work simply ceased. The carvers laid down their tools and walked away, and the quarry was left exactly as it stood on that last day, and has remained so ever since. And so at Raraku today there are hundreds of Moai, nearly half of all the giants that were ever made, caught forever in the very act of their making. Walk the slopes of the quarry, and the wonder of it takes hold. Here is a Moai still lying on its back in the rock, half carved, its front finished in exquisite detail, but its back still joined to the mountain, waiting to be cut free. Here is another, nearly complete, ready to be moved. Here are the great niches in the rock where finished giants once lay. The whole mountainside is a single vast unfinished workshop, abandoned mid-task a few centuries ago. And lying in the quarry is the greatest Moai of all. A colossus still attached to the rock, never finished, never moved. A giant that, had it ever been completed and raised, would have stood as tall as a 6- or 7-story building and weighed many hundreds of tons. It lies there still, half born from the mountain, a monument to an ambition that outran, in the end, the strength even of the whole island to fulfill. The carving itself was done entirely with stone tools, for the Rapa Nui, like all Polynesians, had no metal. They used handpicks of a hard, dense volcanic stone, harder than the soft rock of the quarry, and with these, by endless patient pounding and pecking, they cut the giant figures from the mountain. Thousands of these stone picks still lie scattered about the quarry, dropped where they were used, the very tools that carved the giants. Picture the quarry in its great working days, swarming with carvers, the air ringing with the endless tap and thud of stone on stone, dust rising in the sun, figure after colossal figure taking shape on the mountainside, the finished giants being cut free and eased down the slope to begin their journey. It must have been one of the busiest and most sacred places on the whole island, the very birthplace of the ancestors, humming with the labor of a whole people. And then there are the strangest sights of all. The great Moai standing upright on the slopes below the quarry, buried up to their shoulders or their necks in the earth, so that only their huge heads and faces show above the ground. For centuries these were thought to be heads only, the famous Easter Island heads, until it was found that beneath the earth, each has a full body, buried by the slow washing down of soil over the centuries. Why these giants stand there upright and buried on the quarry slopes is not entirely certain, whether they were set up temporarily to have their backs finished, or were somehow always meant to stand there, or awaited a journey that never came. But they make an unforgettable sight. The great solemn faces rising from the grass of the mountainside, gazing out over the island, half swallowed by the very earth, in the eternal silence of the abandoned quarry. Reino Raraku is, in the end, the beating heart of the whole mystery of Rapa Nui, the place where you feel most keenly the immensity of what these people did, and the strangeness of how it stopped. Hundreds of giants, in every stage of making, frozen forever mid-task. The greatest of all still half-born in the rock, the tools lying where they fell. It is as if the carvers had stepped away only yesterday, and might at any moment return. But of course they did not return, and the giants that were finished had, somehow, to leave the quarry and travel across the island to the distant platforms where they would stand. And here we come to the greatest practical riddle of Rapa Nui, the one that has fascinated and baffled the world for centuries. How, without wheels, without draft animals, without metal or machines of any kind, did these people move their colossal giants, weighing many tons apiece, for miles across their island? To that great mystery we now will turn. It is one of the great puzzles of the ancient world, how the people of Rapa Nui moved their Moai, some of them weighing as much as a heavy truck, from the quarry where they were carved to the platforms, sometimes many miles away, across a hilly island, using nothing but stone tools, rope, timber, and human muscle. For centuries, outsiders who gazed on the giants simply could not imagine how it had been done. Many ideas have been put forward over the years. Perhaps the giants were laid on their backs on great wooden sledges and dragged across the island on rollers of felled palm logs, hauled by hundreds of people pulling on ropes of woven bark. This is how many other ancient peoples moved great stones, and for a long time it seemed the most likely answer, and it would have required immense quantities of timber and rope, and the coordinated labor of a large part of the whole island. And this idea carried a heavy implication, one that became central to the famous story of Rapa Nui's fall. For if the giants were moved on rollers and sledges of wood, then the making of them would have devoured the island's forests, felling the great palms by the thousand to move the stone ancestors. A people, in this telling, quite literally cutting down their own world to carry their giants, until the last tree was gone. But there was always another answer hiding in plain sight in the words of the Rapa Nui themselves. For when the islanders were asked in later times how the giants had been moved, they did not speak of sledges or rollers. They said something stranger and simpler, and long dismissed as mere legend. They said that the Moai walked, that the giants had walked upright from the quarry to their platforms of their own accord. For a long time this was taken as a charming myth, a poetic fancy, not to be taken seriously. But in our own time, some scholars began to wonder whether the old tradition might be quite literally true, whether the giants really had been moved upright on their feet in a way that could honestly be described as walking. And they looked more closely at the Moai themselves for clues. And the clues were there. The Moai made for transport, it was noticed, differ subtly from those set finally on the platforms. They lean slightly forward, and their bases are shaped in a particular curve so that a standing Moai upright would tip and rock in a way that seemed almost designed for movement. What if, some asked, the giants were moved standing up, rocked from side to side, and so walked forward step by rolling step, exactly as the old islanders had always said? And so they tried it. In a remarkable experiment, a team took a full-sized replica Moai, standing upright, and tied ropes to it, one team on each side and one behind, and began in turn to pull, rocking the great figure onto the edge of its base so that it swung forward a little, then rocking it the other way so it swung forward again. And the giant moved, rolling and rocking from side to side, walking on the curved edges of its base. The colossal figure advanced across the ground, upright on its own feet, with just a handful of people and some rope and no wood at all. It was a revelation, for it showed that the giants could indeed have walked, moved upright by a small team with rope alone, needing no sledges, no rollers, no great felling of the forest at all. The old tradition of the walking Moai was not a myth. It may have been the plain, remembered truth, a memory carried down the centuries of exactly how the great feat was really done. And that changes everything about the story we thought we knew. For if the giants walked, then the moving of them did not devour the forests. The whole picture of a people cutting down their world to drag their statues begins to dissolve. The very heart of the famous tale of self-destruction, that the Moai madness consumed the trees, turns out to rest on an assumption that the islanders themselves had always quietly contradicted. We must be honest that the debate is not entirely settled, and scholars still argue over the details of exactly how the giants moved, whether always walking or sometimes by other means. But the walking experiments and the words of the Rapa Nui themselves have shifted the whole picture profoundly. The islanders, it seems, found an ingenious, elegant, economical way to move their giants, one that we, in our cleverness, took centuries to rediscover, and that they had told us all along. There is something wonderful in that the answer to one of the world's great mysteries lay, the whole time, in the simple, honest words of the island's own people, dismissed by outsiders as legend and proven true at last. The giants walked, and having walked across the miles to their appointed platforms, they had then to be raised upright and crowned and given their eyes. To that final feat we now will turn. Having reached its platform at the end of its long walk, a Moai still faced its greatest trial. It had to be raised, from lying flat to standing upright, onto the high stone terrace of the Ahu. A giant weighing many tons lifted by human power alone, without a crane or a machine of any kind, and set precisely in its place. It is, if anything, an even greater feat than the moving. And here, too, the answer lay in patience and ingenuity rather than brute force. The islanders, it is believed, raised the giants by leverage, working the great figure up, little by little, using long wooden levers and, crucially, packing stones beneath it as it rose. Lever the giant up a few inches. Slide stones underneath to hold the gain. Lever again, pack in more stones, and so, over days or weeks, build up a great pile of stones beneath the Moai, tilting it gradually upright until, at last, it stood. It was slow and careful and enormously laborious, requiring the coordinated effort of a whole community and a deep understanding of balance and leverage. But it worked. Inch by inch, stone by stone, the giant was tilted up from the horizontal to the vertical, until it rose at last upon its platform, upright and towering, and the packing stones were cleared away, and the ancestor stood, for the first time, gazing out over the land. And then, for many of the giants, there came a final crowning touch, quite literally. For the great red topknots, the pukeo, carved from the red stone of a separate quarry, had themselves to be lifted up and set upon the giants' heads. How this was done is not certain. Perhaps the topknot was raised up the same growing ramp of stones as the Moai, or levered up separately and eased into place. However it was managed, it added a final splendor to the giant, the great red cylinder crowning the dark stone head, high above the platform. And then, at the very last, the giant was given its eyes, and this was the most sacred moment of all. For until its eyes were set in place, the Moai was, it seems, merely stone, a figure, but not yet a living presence. Only when its eyes were opened did the ancestor truly come into it. Sockets that had been left rough were finished, and into them were fitted eyes of gleaming white coral, with pupils of dark red stone or black obsidian. And with the setting of the eyes, the giant awoke. Now it could see. Now it was alive. Now the mana of the ancestor filled it, and it became the true and living presence of the honored dead, gazing out with its shining white eyes over the clan and its land. The dedication of a Moai, with the opening of its eyes, must have been among the most sacred and joyful and awe-filled moments in the whole life of a Rapa Nui clan. Picture that moment. The great giant newly raised upon its ahu above the shore, crowned with its red topknot. The whole clan gathered, the sacred rites performed, and then the setting of the coral eyes, and the giant at last awake, gazing out over its descendants with its gleaming white eyes, alive with the ancestral power, watching over the living, pouring out its blessing upon the land. After all the years of labor, the ancestor had come home. And so, all around the island, the giants stood, completed, crowned, and awakened, their coral eyes gleaming, ringing the coast, gazing inland over their clans. It must have been a breathtaking sight in the great age of the Moai. The whole island rimmed with the standing ancestors, hundreds of them, on their platforms above the sea, watching over a green and populous land in the sunlight of the Southern Ocean. We so often picture the Moai as we find them now. Bare gray stone, empty-eyed, many of them fallen. But that is not how they were meant to be seen. In their glory they were living presences, crowned with red, bright-eyed with coral, standing proud and awake above a thriving people, charged with sacred power. The bare fallen giants of today are the ruins of what was once a blazing, living, sacred landscape. And behind every single one of them lay an immense human achievement. The carving, the walking, the raising, the crowning, the awakening, each the work of a whole community over a long time, at great cost. Multiply that by nearly 1,000 giants, and you begin to grasp the sheer scale of what the people of Rapa Nui accomplished, alone on their small island, in the great age of the Moai. It was, in truth, one of the most remarkable feats of organized human effort anywhere on Earth, and to appreciate it fully, we must look not just at the giants themselves, but at the whole vast machinery of a society bent to their making. The roads, the labor, the food, the organization that made the impossible possible. To the cost and the achievement of the giants we now will turn. To make nearly 1,000 colossal stone giants on a small and isolated island was not merely a matter of carving and moving stone. It required the sustained, organized effort of a whole society over many generations, a vast and continuous mobilization of labor and food and skill and coordination, all channeled into the sacred work of the ancestors. The Moai are not just sculptures. They are the frozen expression of the entire organized will of the Rapa Nui people. Consider the labor. Carving a giant took a skilled team a long time. Moving it took the coordinated effort of many. Raising it more still. And all those workers had to be fed, which meant that the farmers of the island had to grow a surplus, beyond their own needs, to support the carvers and the movers and the raisers. The whole economy of the island, in a sense, was organized around the giants, a society feeding its own great sacred project. And they built roads for the giants. Radiating out from the quarry at Reino Raraku, across the island, run the remains of the Moai roads, prepared paths along which the great figures made their journeys to the platforms. And along these roads lie fallen giants, Moai that never completed their journey, that toppled or were abandoned along the way, and that lie there still, face down or face up beside the ancient roads, in the middle of their interrupted walk. These fallen giants along the roads are among the most poignant sights on the island, the great ancestors caught forever mid-journey, having left the quarry but never reached their home, lying in the grass where they fell, in the silence of the abandoned roads. They speak, more than almost anything, of the sheer scale and ambition of the enterprise, and perhaps of the strain that ambition finally placed upon the island. For there is a question that hangs over the whole magnificent achievement. What did it cost? To pour so much of a small island's labor and resources, generation after generation, into the raising of stone giants, was this a sustainable devotion or a growing burden? Did the competition between the clans, each straining to outdo the others, drive the effort to a pitch that the little island could not, in the end, bear? These are among the deepest questions of the whole Rapa Nui story. But before we come to those questions of strain and change, let us simply pause and honor the achievement for what it was. Here was a people, alone on the most remote island on Earth, cut off from all humankind, with no metal, no wheels, no draft animals, and only the resources of one small volcanic island, and they carved and moved and raised nearly 1,000 colossal stone giants in one of the greatest concentrated feats of monumental art and engineering in the entire human story. There is no other achievement quite like it anywhere. The pyramids of Egypt were raised by a great and populous kingdom with the wealth of the Nile behind it. The Moai of Rapa Nui were raised by a few thousand people, on a speck of land in the middle of the ocean, in complete isolation with the simplest of tools. Judged against the resources they had, It may be the most astonishing monumental achievement in all of human history. And it was, above all, an achievement of the spirit, of a people's overwhelming devotion to their ancestors, and their genius for turning that devotion into stone. Every giant was an act of love and reverence and memory, a bond made permanent between the living and their honored dead. The whole island became a single vast monument to the ancestors, and to the human need to honor those who came before, and to feel their watchful presence still. It reminds us of something deep and universal in the human heart, the longing to remember our dead, to keep them present, to feel that they watch over us still. Other peoples built tombs and temples and carved their ancestors in 100 ways. The Rapa Nui, alone on their island, built the great stone giants. And in their solemn inland gaze, we can still feel that longing 3 centuries and more after the last of them was raised. So let us hold, above all, this image of the great age of Rapa Nui, the green and populous island, the clans in their territories, the coast ringed with the standing ancestors, crowned in red and bright with coral eyes, gazing inland over a thriving people, their sacred power flowing out across the land. It was the fruit of centuries of devotion and one of the wonders of the human world. But it could not last forever. The very intensity of the effort, the very smallness and isolation of the island, meant that this world was balanced on a knife's edge, and over the generations, slowly, that balance began to shift. To the ordinary life of the island, and then to the great turning that would end the age of the giants, we now will turn. Beyond the great work of the giants, the people of Rapa Nui lived their ordinary lives, farming, fishing, raising their families, worshiping their ancestors, on their small and demanding island. And their daily life is, in its way, as remarkable as the Moai, for it shows a people who wrung a living with great ingenuity from one of the hardest and most isolated homes any humans have ever had. Their life was built, above all, on farming, for the sea, without a sheltering reef, gave less than on many Pacific islands, and the people leaned heavily on their crops. They grew the sweet potato above all, along with taro and yams, bananas and sugarcane, brought long ago across the ocean by their ancestors. In the fertile volcanic soil, in a good season, these could give an abundant harvest, enough to feed the island and to support the great work of the giants. But farming on Rapa Nui was a battle against wind and sun and thin soil, and the islanders met it with real genius. Their most ingenious trick was a thing called lithic mulching, or rock gardening. They covered their fields with a layer of broken stones and rocks. It seems strange to garden among stones, but the rocks sheltered the young plants from the drying wind, trapped moisture in the soil, protected it from erosion, and slowly released minerals as they weathered. Whole areas of the island were turned into these rock gardens, and they let the Rapa Nui grow far more than the bare land alone would ever have allowed. And they guarded their chickens, the one livestock they had, with great care, in the long, low henhouses of piled stone we have already met, protecting this precious source of meat and eggs on an island with so few. They fished what they could from canoes and from the rocks. They gathered from the shore. They made the most of every scrap of food their hard island could provide. Survival here demanded constant ingenuity, and the Rapa Nui had it in abundance. They lived, for much of the island's history, in villages near the coast, and in houses of a very distinctive kind. Long, low, narrow structures shaped, it is often said, like an overturned boat, framed with wood and thatched with reeds and grass, with a low doorway you had to crawl through to enter. The paved foundations of these boathouses and the carved stone doorsills can still be seen on the island today. Around the houses lay the life of the community. The cooking places where food was baked in earth ovens heated with stones. The gardens and the hen houses. The paths between the settlements. And, above all, the sacred ahu with its standing ancestors, the spiritual heart of the clan. It was a life lived close to the land and the sea and the ancestors in the tight-knit world of the clan. And it was a rich culture for all the hardness of the land. The Rapa Nui carved not only the giants but a wealth of smaller things. Wooden figures of strange and haunting beauty, ornaments of shell and bone, fine bark cloth beaten from the paper mulberry. They composed chants and genealogies and legends, carried in memory and recited. They danced and sang. They kept the deep Polynesian love of poetry and story and the spoken word. And they kept, in their minds, the great genealogies, the chains of ancestors reaching back through the generations to the founding chief Hotu Matue and the first voyage across the sea. For a people whose whole religion centered on the ancestors, these genealogies were sacred knowledge of the highest importance, the very charter of each clan's identity and its claim to its land and its mana. To know your ancestors was to know who you were. It was in all a full and sophisticated and deeply human way of life, a whole Polynesian world in miniature, developed in perfect isolation on the loneliest island on earth, sustained by ingenuity and hard work and a profound devotion to the ancestors and the land. We should never let the drama of the giants, or the sadness of what came later, blind us to the ordinary richness of it. Real people living real lives with skill and love and meaning at the very edge of the world. And this isolated people did one more remarkable thing, something no other people of the whole vast Pacific ever did. For the Rapa Nui, alone among all the islanders of Polynesia, appear to have created a form of writing, a script of tiny, intricate signs carved on wooden tablets, which we call rongo-rongo. And it is, like so much on this island, a profound and unsolved mystery. For the rongo-rongo script, like the writing of the Minoans and the Indus far away, has never been deciphered, and, in a further tragedy, almost all of it was lost. It is one of the most tantalizing and heartbreaking of all the riddles of Rapa Nui. A lost people's own writing, surviving on a mere handful of precious tablets, and utterly, so far, unreadable. To the mystery of rongo-rongo we now will turn. Rongo-rongo, the name means, roughly, to recite, to chant, is the name we give to the extraordinary script of Rapa Nui. Rows of tiny, intricate signs carved into wooden tablets, unlike any other writing on earth. That the people of this one small, isolated island should have created writing at all, when no other Polynesian people ever did, is astonishing, and it deepens, rather than solves, the mystery of Rapa Nui. Look at the script, and its strangeness takes hold. The signs are small and beautifully carved, packed in long unbroken rows across the smoothed and polished wood. Little figures of humans and birds and fish and plants and strange creatures and geometric shapes, hundreds of distinct signs, marching in dense lines from end to end of the tablet. And they are written in a curious way, in a system where you read one line left to right, then must turn the whole tablet upside down to read the next, and so on, back and forth, up and down the wood. The tablets were made of wood, and that, in the end, was their undoing. For wood does not last on a wet and windy island as stone does, and the tablets were few and precious, kept, it seems, by a small class of learned men who alone could carve and recite them. And when catastrophe came to Rapa Nui, as we shall see, when the population crashed and the old order was shattered, the knowledge of the script and most of the tablets themselves were lost, burned or rotted or carried away almost beyond recovery. Today, only a couple of dozen genuine Rongorongo objects survive in all the world, scattered in the museums of distant lands, a tiny, precious remnant of what must once have been a much larger body of writing. And on those few surviving tablets, the little signs march on in their thousands, carrying their message down the centuries. A message that, so far, no one has ever been able to read. For Rongorongo has defeated every attempt at decipherment. We do not know for certain even what kind of writing it is, whether it records the Rapa Nui language fully, sound by sound, as true writing does, or whether it is something more limited, a memory aid for reciting chants and genealogies, prompting the reciter rather than spelling out every word. We can see the signs, we can catalog them, but their meaning remains locked away. And the reasons for the difficulty are cruel. There is so little of it left, only those few tablets, and from so small a sample, a lost script is desperately hard to crack. We have no bilingual text, no key. And most tragically of all, the chain was broken. By the time anyone from the outside world tried to understand Rongorongo, the catastrophe had already fallen, and the last islanders who could truly read it were gone, carrying the key with them into the dark. Think of what may be written there, on those few surviving tablets, the chants and the genealogies, the myths and the sacred knowledge of Rapa Nui, set down by the island's own learned men in their own script. The names of the ancestors, the story of the great voyage, the meaning of the giants, the beliefs of a whole lost world. It may all be there, carved in the little signs, and we cannot read a word of it. It is the same ache we have met before on other lost and silent shores, the ache of having the writing but not the reading, of holding a message that a human being carved with care to carry meaning and being locked out of that meaning by the breaking of a fragile chain. Of all the lost scripts of the world, Rongorongo is among the most poignant, so little of it left from so remote a people so nearly lost altogether. Perhaps one day it will be read. Scholars still labor over the tablets, comparing the signs, searching for the pattern that might unlock them, and every so often, a little progress is claimed. Perhaps the key will yet be found, and the talking wood of Rapa Nui will speak at last, and the island's own voice will be heard again after all the silent centuries. Or perhaps it will keep its silence forever, and Rongorongo will remain, like the giants themselves, one of the enduring riddles of the loneliest island on earth, a lost people's writing, surviving on a few scraps of wood, carrying a message we can see but cannot hear, from a world that has otherwise almost entirely passed away. For that world was, even at its height, a fragile one. A few thousand people on a small finite island, pouring their strength into the giants and the gardens and the tablets, balanced always on the edge of what their little world could bear. And that balance over the generations was quietly tipping. To the great turning of the Rapa Nui story, the crowding of the island, and the vanishing of its forest, we now must come. Over the centuries of its isolation, the population of Rapa Nui grew. From the first small band of settlers, the people multiplied generation upon generation, spreading across the island, filling its clans, raising their giants until, at the height of their world, there were many thousands of them. A substantial population, crowded onto a very small and very finite piece of land in the middle of the sea. And here lay the deep and inescapable predicament of Rapa Nui. For an island is a closed world, with hard edges and fixed limits. On a continent, a growing people can spread out, move on, open new land. But on a small island, in the middle of the vast ocean, with nowhere else to go, for the nearest land was 1,000 miles away, and the great voyaging days were over. A growing population presses harder and harder against the fixed and unyielding limits of its little world. As the numbers grew, the people worked their island ever harder. More and more of the land was cleared and planted. The rock gardens spread across the hillsides. The demands on the soil and the forest and the sea and every resource of the island mounted year by year. A world that had once seemed spacious and abundant to a handful of settlers grew steadily tighter and more crowded and more fully used, as the generations passed and the people multiplied. And all the while, the great work of the giants went on. Indeed, it seems to have intensified, the Moai growing larger and more numerous over time, as the clans competed ever more fiercely in the honoring of the ancestors. So the island's people were pouring their labor at once into feeding a growing population and into raising ever greater giants. Two immense demands upon a small and finite land, pressing together upon its limited strength. It was, in a sense, a magnificent and precarious balance. A whole society working its island to the very edge of its capacity, sustaining a large population and a staggering monumental effort on a speck of land in the middle of the ocean. For a long time, through ingenuity and hard work, they held that balance. But the margins were thin and growing thinner, and a world balanced so finely on the edge of its limits is a world vulnerable to any shift, any shock, any slow change in the foundations on which it rests. And a slow change was indeed underway, the most consequential of all. For the crowding of the island, and the working of the land, and the growing of the people, were pressing hardest of all upon the one resource that underlay everything else, and that could not, once gone, be quickly restored. The great forest that had covered the island when the first settlers came, and that was, slowly but surely, disappearing. When the first Polynesians landed, remember, Rapa Nui was densely wooded, covered in a forest dominated by a giant palm. But by the time the first Europeans arrived, centuries later, the island was almost entirely bare, grassland and scrub, with scarcely a tree to be seen. Somewhere in between, Across the centuries of Rapa Nui's isolation, the whole forest of the island had vanished utterly and completely. And the vanishing of that forest is the great pivot on which the whole later story of Rapa Nui turns. For the loss of the forest was no small thing. The trees gave timber for houses, for canoes, for the great work of the island. They gave shelter to the soil, holding it against the wind and rain. Their roots held the fertile earth in place. They were part of the whole living fabric of the island's world. To lose them entirely was to change the island forever and to strike at the very foundations of the life the Rapa Nui had built. And so the great questions gather. Why did the forest vanish? Was it the fault of the people themselves? Did they cut it all down recklessly and so destroy their own world? Or was the story more complicated and less simple as a tale of guilt? And what did the loss of the forest really do to the Rapa Nui? Did it bring the catastrophe of legend or something quieter and stranger? These are among the most argued questions in all of archaeology. For the fall of Rapa Nui, the vanishing of the forest, the toppling of the giants, the collapse of the old world, has become one of the most famous cautionary tales in all of history. A story of a people who destroyed their environment and paid the ultimate price. But that famous story, we now know, is in large part wrong, and the truth is stranger and more interesting and in important ways kinder to the Rapa Nui. To the vanishing forest and the real story of the fall we now will turn. The disappearance of Rapa Nui's forest is beyond doubt. The buried pollen tells the story plainly. A wooded island at the settlement, a bare one by the time the Europeans came. The great palm that had dominated the forest vanished entirely, gone extinct on the island, along with the other trees. The question is not whether the forest was lost, but how and why, and here the famous story and the newer evidence part ways. The famous story, the one most of us have heard, runs like this: that the Rapa Nui, in their obsession with the giants and in the pressure of their growing numbers, simply cut down their forest, felling the great palms to make rollers and sledges for moving the Moai, to build their canoes and houses, to clear land for their fields, to burn for their fires, recklessly, heedlessly, until, in a stroke of terrible folly, the very last tree was felled, and the forest was gone forever. A people, in this telling, who destroyed their own world with their own hands. It is a powerful story and a famous one, and it has been told again and again as the great parable of environmental self-destruction, the island as a warning to the whole world of what happens when a people uses up the resources of its home. And there is surely some truth in it. The Rapa Nui did clear the forest, for their fields and their fires and their needs, and human hands did play a part in its loss. But in recent years, as archaeologists have looked harder, the simple story of reckless self-destruction has begun to fall apart, and a more complicated and more interesting truth has emerged. And at the heart of it lies an unexpected culprit, one that came to the island not on purpose, but as a stowaway in the very first canoes, the rat. For the Polynesian rat came with the settlers, as it did to islands all across the Pacific, and on Rapa Nui, with no predators and endless food, it multiplied into untold millions. And the rats, it turns out, ate the palm. They gnawed the nuts of the great palm tree, the seeds from which new palms would grow in enormous numbers, so that even where the trees were not felled, few new ones could ever sprout to replace the old. The forest, attacked from below by the rats and from above by human clearing, could not renew itself and slowly, inexorably, died out. So the loss of the forest was not, it seems, a simple act of reckless folly, but the result of a slower and more tangled process, human clearing and rat predation together, over centuries, preventing the forest from renewing itself until at last it was gone. It was, in part, an accident, the unintended work of a stowaway rodent, as much as a crime. The Rapa Nui did not simply, stupidly, chop down their world. And here is the most important correction of all. The old story held that the loss of the forest brought catastrophe, that it triggered starvation and warfare and a great collapse of the population, so that the island fell into ruin and the people nearly destroyed themselves, all before the Europeans ever arrived. This is the famous tale of Rapa Nui as ecological suicide. And this, the newer evidence increasingly suggests, is largely wrong. For the Rapa Nui, it turns out, adapted. As the forest went, they leaned ever harder on their ingenious rock gardens and on their other resources, and they went on feeding themselves and even, for a time, continuing their lives on a treeless island without the great collapse the old story imagines. They were not helpless fools destroyed by their own mistake. They were a resourceful people who met a slow environmental change with real ingenuity and endured it. The evidence now suggests that the island's population, before the Europeans came, was not a civilization that had already crashed in famine and war, but a people who had come through the loss of their forest and adapted to their changed world, and were living on, reduced, perhaps, and changed, but not destroyed. The great collapse, the true catastrophe, the near extinction of the Rapa Nui, was still to come, and it would come not from within, but from beyond the sea. But something did change in these later centuries, for the great age of the giants did come to an end. The carving stopped, and, in time, the standing ancestors were pulled down. If it was not a simple ecological collapse that ended the age of the Moai, then what was it? To the end of the giants, and the strange new world that rose in their place, we now must turn. The great age of the Moai did come to an end. At some point over the later centuries of Rapa Nui's history, the carvers laid down their tools in the quarry of Reino Raraku, and the raising of new giants ceased. The half-finished figures were left in the rock, the Moai on the roads were abandoned mid-journey, and the long, extraordinary tradition of the stone ancestors, which had shaped the whole island for centuries, quietly came to its close. Why did it end? This is one of the central questions of the whole Rapa Nui story, and, as we have seen, the old easy answer, that the island collapsed in ecological ruin and warfare, no longer holds up so simply. The truth seems to be a slower and more subtle thing, a gradual change in the island's world, and in its society, and in its beliefs, that made the old work of the giants no longer possible or no longer wanted. Part of it, surely, was the changed island itself. In a world without forest, with the soil thinner and the resources tighter and the old abundance gone, it may simply have grown too hard to sustain the enormous effort of the giants, to spare the labor and the food from the daily struggle to feed the people. A society working ever harder just to live may have had less and less to spare for the raising of colossal stone. But there was perhaps a deeper reason still, a change not just in the island but in the heart. For the whole point of the Moai had been the manna of the ancestors, their sacred power, flowing out through the giants to make the crops grow and the people prosper. And what happens to that faith when, despite all the giants gazing inland, the forest dies, and the old abundance fades, and life on the island grows harder and harder? What happens when the ancestors, for all the labor lavished upon them, no longer seem to be keeping their side of the bargain? Perhaps, over the generations, a doubt crept in, a slow erosion of the old confidence that the ancestors, honored in stone, would protect and bless their people. And a society that had poured its whole spirit into the giants, and found that the giants did not save it from a hardening world, might well have begun at last to turn away from them, to lose faith in the old ancestor cult, and to seek its blessings and its meaning elsewhere. For that, it seems, is what happened. The old order of the clans and the chiefs and the ancestor giants gave way, over time, to something new and very different, a new religion, and a new way of ordering society, centered no longer on the ancestors in their stone, but on a god and a bird and a strange annual contest of which we shall hear shortly. The world of the Moai was passing, and a new world was being born to replace it. And in that passing, the giants themselves were not merely abandoned. They were, in time, pulled down. All around the island, one by one, the great Moai were toppled from their platforms, thrown down from the ahu on which they had stood for generations, to lie face down or face up in the earth, their reign as the watchful ancestors of the clans brought deliberately to an end. When exactly this toppling happened, and why, is one of the most fascinating and revised questions of all. For a long time it was imagined as a great convulsion of warfare, the clans, in the ruin of the collapse, tearing down one another's ancestors in fury and despair. But the timeline we now know is more complicated and more surprising, for when the first Europeans came in the early 18th century, many of the giants were still standing, and it was over the following century and more, as we shall see, that most of them came down. So the toppling of the giants was not, it seems, simply the climax of a pre-European collapse. Much of it happened later, during and after the very century in which the Europeans arrived, and in which the catastrophe from beyond the sea fell upon the island. The falling of the giants and the great tragedy of contact are tangled together in ways we are only now beginning to understand. Yet the turning away from the giants had surely begun before the ships came. The carving had already stopped. The new religion was already rising. The toppling, when it came, was the outward sign of a change in the island's soul that was already well underway. The old ancestor cult losing its hold, the giants losing their sacred power in the minds of the people, until the once holy figures could be, at last, pulled down. It is a strange and poignant thing to contemplate. A people deliberately toppling the very giants their ancestors had labored so mightily to raise, letting the great stone faces fall into the grass, turning away from the old gods of stone toward a new faith. And it leads us to two of the most important corrections in the whole modern understanding of Rapa Nui: the truth about the supposed Great Collapse, and the strange new world of the birdman. To the honest reckoning with the fall we now will turn. Let us dwell for a moment on the toppling itself, for it is one of the most haunting images of the whole Rapa Nui story. The great stone ancestors, raised with such immense labor, thrown down one by one, until, in the end, not a single Moai was left standing upright on its platform anywhere on the island. Every giant that the world later found standing had been re-raised in modern times. When the outsiders came in the fullness of the tragedy, they had all fallen. The giants were toppled with evident purpose. Many were thrown forward to fall face down in the earth, their gaze buried in the ground. And some, it seems, were toppled in a way that ensured they would break. Pulled down so that the neck struck a stone placed ready beneath, snapping the great head from the body. There is a deliberateness to it, a finality, that speaks of more than mere neglect. The giants were not just left to fall, but were brought down and, in some cases, broken. What did it mean to topple a Moai? To a people for whom the giant embodied the living presence and the sacred power of the ancestor, throwing it down was a profound and terrible act. The toppling of the ancestor himself, the breaking of his gaze, the ending of his watch over the land. Whether done in the bitterness of clan against clan, or in the turning of a whole people away from the old faith, it was the deliberate unmaking of what had been most sacred. Some of the toppling, no doubt, came in conflict between the clans, for as the old order broke down and the hard times pressed, rivalries surely turned bitter, and to throw down a rival clan's ancestors, to break their mana, would have been a devastating blow. The old story of Rapa Nui imagined this warfare as a great bloody collapse, and while the reality was less apocalyptic than the legend, there was surely real conflict and real bitterness in the island's later days. But much of the toppling, as we have seen, came late, during and after the century of European contact, as the island's whole world was shattered by the catastrophe from outside. As the population crashed and the old society dissolved under the blows that came from beyond the sea, the last remaining giants were pulled down until, by the later 19th century, every one of them had fallen. The toppling of the giants was, in part, a symptom of the island's destruction by the outside world, not merely of any internal collapse. And so the giants lay fallen, hundreds of them, face down and broken, across the whole island, in the grass, along the roads, on their abandoned platforms. A landscape of toppled ancestors, silent and prone beneath the ocean sky. It was in this state that the world came to know them, not the standing, seeing, sacred giants of the great age, but the fallen ruins of a world that had turned away from them and then been shattered from without. It is worth pausing on the poignancy of it. The people of Rapa Nui had accomplished one of the greatest feats of devotion and labor in all of human history, raising their 1,000-stone ancestors on the loneliest island on earth. And then they had, with their own hands, thrown them down, everyone. It is a story of creation and of unmaking, of faith and of the loss of faith, played out in colossal stone on a speck of land in the sea. And yet, this is the modern turn in the tale. We should not read that unmaking as the simple self-destruction of a foolish people. The giants fell as part of a long and complex change, a shift of religion, a hardening of the island's world, and, above all, the terrible blows that came from outside. The Rapa Nui did not simply, madly destroy themselves and their works. Their story is far more tangled and far more human than that. For the great famous lesson of Easter Island, the parable of the people who destroyed their own world and collapsed into ruin, a warning to all humanity, is, we now increasingly believe, largely a myth, a powerful story told and retold that the evidence no longer supports. The real story is different, and in important ways it clears the name of the Rapa Nui. Let us look at that honest reckoning squarely, for it matters. For the truth we owe to these people is not the truth of the cautionary tale, but the truth of the evidence, and the evidence, gathered patiently in recent years, tells a story not of reckless self-destruction, but of resilience, adaptation, and, at the last, of a catastrophe inflicted from without. To that honest reckoning with the fall of Rapa Nui, we now will turn. The famous story of Easter Island goes like this: that a people, obsessed with building statues, recklessly destroyed their forest and their environment, overshot the limits of their small world, and collapsed, before any European ever arrived, into starvation, warfare, and even cannibalism, so that a great and doomed civilization had already reduced itself to a ruined remnant, a self-made catastrophe, a warning to us all. It is a gripping and terrible tale. And much of it, the newer evidence suggests, simply is not true. Consider the pieces of the old story one by one. The idea that moving the Moai devoured the forest, undermined, as we have seen, by the discovery that the giants may have walked upright, needing little wood at all. The idea that the forest's loss was reckless human folly, complicated by the role of the stowaway rats in preventing the palm from renewing itself. Piece by piece, the tale of simple self-destruction has been coming apart. Consider the supposed Great Collapse, the pre-European crash into famine and war. The archaeology increasingly does not show it. There is little good evidence for a huge population that then catastrophically collapsed before contact. Rather, the picture is of a people who adapted to their changing island, leaned on their ingenious rock gardens, and sustained themselves in a treeless world without the great die-off the legend requires. They changed and endured. They did not, it seems, collapse. Consider even the famous evidence for terrible warfare, the thousands of sharp obsidian points, the Moai, scattered across the island, long taken as the weapons of a society tearing itself apart. But when these were studied closely, their shapes turned out to be wrong for weapons of war, too varied, too blunt, better suited to cutting and scraping and working plants. The Moai, it now seems, were mostly everyday tools, not instruments of a great slaughter. The evidence for apocalyptic pre-contact warfare largely dissolved. So the great collapse of legend, the ecological suicide, the self-inflicted ruin, increasingly looks like a story we told about the Rapa Nui, rather than a thing that actually happened to them. It is a powerful and useful parable, and it has done real good in making the world think about the limits of its own resources. But as history, as the truth about a real people, it appears to be, in large part, false. And it is worth asking why we were so ready to believe it. There is something uncomfortable in the eagerness with which the outside world embraced the tale of the Rapa Nui destroying themselves. A story that, conveniently placed all the blame on the islanders' own folly and drew attention away from what outsiders, in fact, did to them. The myth of self-destruction let the wider world off the hook for the real catastrophe, which, as we shall see, it largely caused. For the truth is that the Rapa Nui, before the Europeans came, were not a ruined and self-destroyed remnant, but a living, adapting, enduring people, changed by the loss of their forest, yes, and by the passing of the age of the giants, but very much alive, sustaining themselves with skill and ingenuity on their hard and treeless island, and developing, even, a whole new religion and social order to meet their changed world. This is not to pretend that all was well, that there was no hardship, no conflict, no strain in the island's later centuries. Surely there was. A small isolated people meeting a hard environmental change would have known real difficulty and real conflict. But that is a very different thing from the legend of a great civilization annihilating itself in an orgy of statue building and forest felling and war. The reality is more ordinary and more human, and more to the islanders' credit. The honest reckoning, then, restores to the Rapa Nui their dignity, and their achievement, and their resilience. They found the loneliest island on Earth. They built a civilization on it in perfect isolation. They raised 1,000 giants against all odds, and when their world changed, they adapted and endured and remade their society and survived. That is the true story, and it is a far greater and nobler one than the myth of the fools who destroyed themselves. And part of that remade world, that new order which rose as the age of the giants passed, was one of the strangest and most vivid religions in all the human record, the cult of the birdman, centered on a sacred islet, a perilous swim, and the egg of a seabird. To the birdman of Rapa Nui we now will turn. As the old cult of the ancestor giants faded, a new religion rose to take its place on Rapa Nui, utterly different and utterly strange, the cult of the birdman, the Tangata Manu. Where the old faith had honored the ancestors in colossal, permanent stone, the new one turned on a fleeting, dangerous, once-a-year contest, and on the return each spring of a migratory seabird to a rocky islet off the coast. At the southwestern corner of the island, high on the rim of a great volcanic crater, with the sea crashing far below, the people built a special sacred village, Orongo, a cluster of low stone houses on the very edge of the cliff, looking out over the ocean toward 3 small rocky islets rising from the waves offshore. And here, each year, the strange and perilous ritual of the birdman was played out. For each spring, a particular seabird, the sooty tern, came to nest on the largest of those offshore islets, Motu Nui. And the great contest was this, to be the first to bring back from that islet the first egg of the season. The chiefs and leading men of the clans would each put forward a champion, a young man, and these champions would make the descent of the terrible cliff and swim out through the shark-haunted, surging sea to the islet, and there wait, sometimes for weeks, for the birds to lay. And the first champion to find the first egg would raise a great shout and carry the precious egg back, swimming the dangerous strait again with the egg bound to his head, climbing the sheer cliff, and present it to his master. And that master, the sponsor of the winning champion, became, for the coming year, the Tangata Manu, the birdman. A sacred figure, hedged with taboo, holding a special mana and a special authority over the island until the next year's contest. It was a religion of a completely different character from the old cult of the giants, competitive, athletic, dangerous, renewed afresh each year, its power passing annually from one man and one clan to the next, rather than fixed forever in permanent stone. It centered on a god called Make, the creator, closely tied to the seabirds and the egg and the return of life each spring. And it seems to have provided a new way of ordering the island's society and settling the rivalries of its clans in the world that came after the Moai. All around the sacred village of Orongo, the people carved into the rocks the image of the birdman himself, a figure with a human body crouched, and the head and the great curved beak of a bird, often holding an egg. Hundreds of these carvings, covering the boulders of the sacred place, gazing out toward the islet and the sea. They can still be seen today, one of the most striking and enigmatic bodies of rock carving anywhere in the Pacific. Picture the contest in its great days. The champions gathered at Orongo on the cliff edge, the descent of the sheer rock to the pounding sea, the long swim out to the islet through the dangerous water, the weeks of waiting on the barren rock, the shout of triumph as the first egg was found, the perilous return, and the making of the new birdman amid the chanting of the people on the crater rim, with the whole vast ocean spread out below. It was a spectacle as strange and vivid as anything in the human story. And it shows us, once more, the deep truth about the Rapa Nui that the old legend obscured, that they were not a people who simply collapsed and died, but a people who, when their old world changed, remade it, who let go of the giants and built a whole new religion and social order to meet their new circumstances, with all the creativity and resilience that had marked them from the beginning. The Birdman cult is the sign not of a people destroyed, but of a people adapting and enduring and going on. For go on they did through the passing of the giants and the rise of the Birdman into the 18th century, still living their remade life on their remote island, still utterly alone in the vast Pacific, as they had been for 1,000 years. But their long isolation was at last about to end. For out on the great empty ocean, sails were approaching that the Rapa Nui had never seen, and with them would come a catastrophe beyond anything in the island's history. To the coming of the outside world we now must turn. For 1,000 years the people of Rapa Nui had been alone, utterly, completely alone, the most isolated human community on the face of the earth, with no contact of any kind with the rest of humankind. They had built their whole world in that isolation. And then, on a spring day 3 centuries ago, that long solitude came at last to its end. For sails appeared on the horizon, ships such as no living islander had ever seen. It was Easter Sunday in the year 1722 when a Dutch expedition, crossing the vast Pacific, chanced upon the lonely island, and, finding it on that day, gave it the name by which the world would know it ever after, Easter Island. For the Rapa Nui, it was the arrival of beings from beyond the edge of their known world. For the Europeans, it was the discovery of an astonishing and baffling place, ringed with colossal stone giants, in the middle of the empty ocean. Imagine the wonder and the fear on both sides. The islanders, who had thought themselves alone in all the world, saw great ships and strange pale men appear from the empty sea. The Europeans saw a remote, treeless island its shores lined with enormous stone figures, and could scarcely believe that the people they found there, a few thousand islanders with no metal, no great ships, no obvious means, could possibly have raised such things. The mystery of the Moai was born in that very first astonished encounter. And crucially, on that first visit, the giants were still standing. The Dutch described the great stone figures upright on their platforms along the coast, still crowned, still gazing inland. The age of raising them was over, and the new world of the birdman had come, but the ancestors still stood. The island the first Europeans saw was still, in its outward face, the island of the standing giants. That first contact was brief and marred, as such meetings so often were, by misunderstanding and violence. A sudden, deadly skirmish on the shore before the ships sailed away. And then the island was left alone again, for decades, its solitude only briefly broken. But the world now knew that Rapa Nui was there, and over the following century more ships would come, explorers and traders, and others with darker purposes. Over the following decades, a handful of further expeditions called at the island, among them the great British navigator James Cook, who came in the 1770s, and whose visit gives us another precious glimpse. And by then, something had changed. For Cook's people reported that some of the giants had fallen, that here and there the great figures lay toppled from their platforms. The long process of the toppling, it seems, was now underway. So across the 18th century, as the outside world came and went, the giants were coming down, whether in the last convulsions of the clan rivalries, or in the slow turning away from the old faith, or in the growing disturbances that contact itself was bringing. Visit by visit, the record shows more of them fallen, until, in time, none would be left standing at all. The age of the ancestors was ending in these very years before the outsider's eyes. And the coming of the outside world brought more than observation. It brought, as it did everywhere, new diseases, sicknesses against which the long isolated islanders, who had never met them, had no defense at all. Even the briefest contact could leave illness behind, and on an island that had been sealed away from the world's diseases for 1,000 years, the toll of these new sicknesses, over time, would be terrible. For this is the grim pattern that played out across the whole Pacific and the whole New World, wherever the isolated peoples met the wider world. That the diseases of the outsiders, far more than their weapons, brought death on an unimaginable scale to those who had no immunity. And Rapa Nui, the most isolated place of all, was terribly vulnerable. The ships that brought the world to the island brought, in their wake, the seeds of its greatest catastrophe. Through the later 18th and early 19th centuries, then, the island endured this slow, gathering shadow. Occasional ships, growing disturbances introduced sickness, the giants falling one by one. Its ancient isolation broken, its old world fading, its people meeting, for the first time, the dangerous currents of the wider world. But the worst was still to come. For the true catastrophe, the blow that would nearly annihilate the Rapa Nui altogether, fell in a single terrible decade in the middle of the 19th century. And it came not as an accident of disease alone, but as a deliberate cruelty, the darkest thing that the outside world did to the loneliest island on Earth. To that catastrophe, which we will tell gently, but must not leave out, we now sorrowfully must turn. In the 1860s, a terrible thing happened to Rapa Nui, the blow from which it very nearly did not recover, and which, more than anything the islanders ever did to themselves, was the true catastrophe of their history. Ships came to the island, from the coast of South America, not to explore or to trade, but to seize its people and carry them away across the sea into forced labor. They were slave raiders. Over a span of a few years, raid after raid fell upon the island. The raiders came ashore and seized the Rapa Nui, hundreds, and then, over time, well over 1,000 of them, a great part of the whole population, and took them away in their ships across the ocean to labor and to die in distant lands, far from their island home. We will draw a veil over the cruelty of it, but it stripped the island of a huge portion of its people in a very short time. And among those taken were the most precious of all, the chiefs, the priests, the learned men, the keepers of the island's sacred knowledge. For the raiders often seized the leaders and the wise, and with them went the memory of the old ways, the genealogies, the chants, and, above all, the knowledge of the Rongorongo script. The few who could still read the talking wood were carried off and died far away, and so the key to the writing was lost, almost certainly forever, in these very raids. Under international outcry, a small number of the captured islanders were eventually to be returned to Rapa Nui. But this terribly only deepened the catastrophe. For the returning islanders carried sickness with them, smallpox, and brought it home to the island, and the disease, loosed upon a people already shattered and with no immunity, swept through the survivors in a devastating epidemic, killing them in their multitudes. Between the raids and the diseases they brought, the population of Rapa Nui, in the space of a few years, simply collapsed. Not slowly, not through any fault of the islanders' own, but suddenly and catastrophically, under the blows that came from beyond the sea. A people who had numbered, not long before, in the thousands, was reduced by the 1870s to a tiny remnant. Barely more than 100 souls survived on the whole island. Barely 100 people. Let that number rest a moment. From the many thousands who had raised the giants and swum for the birdman's egg, there remained, after the raids and the plagues, scarcely more than 100 living Rapa Nui in all the world. It was a near total annihilation, an extinction only just averted, and it happened not in some dim prehistoric collapse, but in recorded history within living memory of our own age and at the hands of the outside world. And with those lost thousands went, almost entirely, the old world of Rapa Nui, the knowledge, the traditions, the sacred lore, the memory of what the giants had meant and how they had been made and moved. The chain of living memory, stretching back 1,000 years to the founding voyage, was very nearly severed altogether. So much of what we do not know about Rapa Nui we do not know because of these raids, because the people who held the answers were carried away and killed. This is the true fall of Rapa Nui, not the myth of a people who destroyed their own world in an orgy of statue building, but the reality of a people very nearly destroyed by the greed and cruelty of others in a single terrible decade of slaving and disease. It is a very different story, and a far sadder and juster one, than the famous parable of ecological suicide. The Rapa Nui did not do this to themselves. It was done to them. And it is why the old cautionary tale rankles when you know the real history, for it blames the victims and quietly exonerates the true culprits. The world found it comfortable to say that the islanders destroyed themselves. It was far less comfortable to face what slave ships and smallpox, coming from the wider world, had actually done to the loneliest and most defenseless people on Earth. The honest reckoning with Rapa Nui is, in part, a reckoning of the outside world with itself. And yet, and here the darkness lifts just a little, the Rapa Nui were not, in the end, extinguished. That tiny remnant of barely 100 survivors did not vanish. They held on. They endured. And from that handful, against all the odds, the Rapa Nui people carried their island, and their name and their memory, forward into the future. To their survival and their endurance to this day we now, at last, will turn. From barely 100 souls the Rapa Nui endured. It is one of the most remarkable survivals in all of human history, that a people reduced so near to extinction, their leaders and their learned men gone, their old world shattered, should nonetheless have held on to life and to their identity and carried themselves forward from that terrible low point into the world of today. The decades after the catastrophe were hard and often bitter. The island, its population gone, was largely turned over to outsiders. Leased in time as a great sheep ranch, its surviving people confined for many years to a single small settlement. Their movements restricted, their land taken, their old life all but impossible. It was another long chapter of hardship and injustice, laid upon a people who had already suffered almost everything. And yet, through all of it, the Rapa Nui held to who they were. They kept their language, the old Polynesian tongue of the island, still spoken today. They kept their memories and their genealogies as best they could, though so much had been lost. They kept their connection to the land of their ancestors and to the fallen giants that lay all around them, the silent stone witnesses to the greatness of the people they came from. Slowly, over the generations, their numbers recovered, growing again from that tiny remnant. And slowly, too, their situation improved. The injustices of the ranch era were, in time, lifted. The people regained their freedom of the island, and a growing measure of control over their own affairs and their own heritage. The Rapa Nui were coming back, from the very edge of oblivion, into their own. Today, thousands of Rapa Nui live upon the island once more, the direct descendants of that handful of survivors, and through them of the people who carved the giants and swam for the birdman's egg. They speak their language, they dance their dances, they sing the old songs, they keep and celebrate and share with the world the extraordinary heritage of their ancestors. The people of Rapa Nui are very much alive, and they have reclaimed their giants. For the great work of modern times on Rapa Nui has been the raising up again of the fallen ancestors, the careful re-erection, by archaeologists and by the Rapa Nui themselves, of Moai that had lain toppled for a century and more, so that once again, at certain sacred places along the coast, the great stone figures stand upright upon their platforms, gazing inland over the land, as they did in the age of their glory. There is a deep and moving fittingness in that the descendants of the people who raised the giants, and then, in the turning of their history, threw them down, should now, in our own time, raise them up once more. That the ancestors should stand again above the shore, reawakened after their long fall, watching once more over the living children of Rapa Nui. It is a kind of healing and a kind of homecoming. And the world, too, has come to Rapa Nui, for the island, so long the loneliest place on earth, is now visited by travelers from every corner of the globe, drawn by the wonder of the giants and the haunting beauty of the place. The Moai that once gazed only over their own small clans now gaze out, in a sense, over the whole of humankind, which comes across the great ocean, as the first voyagers did, to stand before them in awe. And with that fame has come, at last, a measure of justice, a growing recognition of what was truly done to the Rapa Nui, and a growing effort to tell their story honestly. Not as the parable of a people who destroyed themselves, but as the true history of a people who achieved something magnificent against impossible odds, who adapted and endured through hardship, and who survived even the near extinction that others inflicted upon them. For that, in the end, is the truest thing about Rapa Nui, not the fall but the endurance, not the toppling of the giants, but the survival of the people who raised them. Against the loneliness of the ocean, against the hardening of their island, against the slave ships and the plagues, the Rapa Nui held on, and are here still. And their giants stand again above the sea. To the wonder that remains, and the riddles still unsolved, we now gently will turn. Rapa Nui today is a place of pilgrimage and of wonder. A small green island in the vast Pacific, ringed once more at its sacred sites, with the standing stone ancestors, and home to the living people who are their heirs. And it holds, still, some of the deepest and most haunting mysteries in all the human story, riddles that draw the mind back again and again across the great ocean to that far and lonely shore. Go to the quarry at Reino Raraku and stand among the hundreds of giants frozen in the very act of their making, the half-carved figures still joined to the rock, the great faces rising from the grass of the slopes, the tools lying where they were dropped, and feel the strangeness of a work interrupted centuries ago and never resumed, as if the carvers had stepped away only moments before. Go to the great platform of Tongariki, where 15 giants stand once more in a mighty row, re-raised in our own time, gazing inland beneath the ocean sky, the largest ahu of all restored to something of its ancient glory, and feel the awe that the people of the clan must have felt, standing beneath their ancestors in the great age of the Moai. Go to the sacred village of Orongo, on the knife edge of the crater rim, with the sea crashing far below and the birdman islet rising from the waves offshore, and the hundreds of birdmen carvings upon the rocks, and feel the strangeness of that later faith, the perilous swim, the sacred egg, the whole vivid world that rose when the age of the giants had passed. And everywhere, feel the presence of the great riddles that endure. How exactly were the giants moved? Did they truly all walk? What precisely ended the age of the Moai, and why were they thrown down? And above all, what does the talking wood say? What message do the little signs of Rongo carry, that we still, after all this time, cannot read? For the Rongo tablets sit still in their distant museums, their signs marching on in silence, keeping the last secrets of the island's own voice. Perhaps some future scholar will find the key at last. Perhaps the talking wood will speak and tell us, in the Rapa Nui's own words, the things we most long to know. Or perhaps it will hold its silence forever, one of the enduring mysteries of the loneliest island on earth. And there is a rightness, somehow, in the mysteries remaining, for Rapa Nui has always been a place at the very edge of the knowable, the farthest outpost of the human world, wrapped in the vastness of the ocean and the depth of time. That it should keep still a little of its mystery, that the giants should hold their deepest secrets, gazing out in silence, seems fitting for the loneliest and strangest of all the places that humankind has made its home. But of the great things we do now know, none is more important than this correction of the old story, that the Rapa Nui were not the authors of their own destruction, but a resilient and resourceful people who did something magnificent, adapted to great change, and survived even near extinction. To carry away from their story that truer understanding is to do them a kind of justice across the centuries and the ocean. And to carry away, too, a sense of wonder at the boldness of the voyage that found the island, at the devotion and ingenuity that raised the giants, at the endurance that carried the people through catastrophe to the present day. Rapa Nui is not, in the end, a tale of doom. It is a tale of the astonishing reach and creativity and resilience of the human spirit, played out on the loneliest stage in all the world. So let us hold, above all, that image of endurance and of wonder as we come toward the close of our long journey. The great stone ancestors standing again above the sea, re-raised by the descendants of those who first raised them. The living people of Rapa Nui, the children of the survivors, keeping their island and their story, and the endless ocean all around under the vast and brilliant stars. To the last of it and to rest we now will come. Let the whole story settle now, gently, in the quiet. Think of the sheer sweep of it, beginning with a handful of voyagers in an open canoe, crossing the emptiest ocean on earth, guided by the stars and the swell, to find a green speck of land no one knew was there, and ending, 1,000 years and more later, with the great stone giants standing again above the sea, and the people of Rapa Nui enduring on their island still. Think of what they built, alone at the edge of the world. A whole civilization in perfect isolation. A coast ringed with 1,000 colossal ancestors, crowned in red, bright-eyed with coral, gazing inland over a thriving people. A faith of the sacred dead, and then a faith of the birdman and the egg. A script of little signs carved in wood. A life wrung with ingenuity from one of the hardest homes any people ever had. It is one of the great achievements of the human spirit. Think of what they endured. The vanishing of their forest, met not with collapse but with the patient ingenuity of the rock gardens. The passing of the age of the giants and the remaking of their whole world. And then the catastrophe from beyond the sea, the slave ships and the plagues that reduced them to a mere 100 souls. And even from that, their refusal to be extinguished, their survival, their return. And think at the last of the giants themselves, the great stone faces, standing once more above the shore, gazing inland over the grass and the sea, as they have in one age or another for 1,000 years. They have watched over a thriving clan. They have lain toppled and broken in the earth, and they stand again now re-raised, watching over the living descendants of the people who made them. They have seen it all in their long stone silence. There is no place on earth quite like Rapa Nui. No place so far, so alone, so strange, so haunting. No monument quite like the silent giants gazing out over the empty ocean at the very edge of the world. And there is no human story quite like it either. The boldest voyage, the loneliest home, the greatest devotion, the deepest fall, and the most remarkable survival, all played out on a single green speck in the vastness of the sea. And whatever mysteries remain, the walking of the giants, the ending of their age, the silence of the talking wood, they only deepen the wonder of it. For Rapa Nui reminds us of how far the human spirit can reach, and how much it can make, and how much it can bear, and how it can endure even the very worst and go on. The stone ancestors, gazing out over the ocean, are a monument not to doom, but to the astonishing resilience of our kind. So let the great stone faces stand now in your mind above the darkening sea. The surf beating soft on the black rocks below, the ocean wind moving over the island grass, the last light fading from the solemn faces, and the enormous southern sky beginning to fill overhead with more stars than you have ever seen, wheeling slowly above the loneliest island in all the world. The people of Rapa Nui sleep now on their island, the children of the voyagers and the carvers and the survivors, safe in the keeping of their ancestors and their sea. And the great giants keep their watch above the shore, as they have through all the long ages, through the raising and the toppling and the raising again, through catastrophe and endurance, gazing out patient and eternal over the endless murmuring ocean. And so we come gently to the end of our long journey to the edge of the world, to the loneliest island, and the boldest voyage, and the great stone ancestors, and the people who made them and who endure still. There remains only to let it all go softly into the quiet of the night and to rest. Let the island grow quiet now in the deepening dusk. The travelers have gone. The day is done. The great stone faces stand dark against the last of the light. The surf beats its endless slow rhythm on the black rocks. The wind moves soft and warm over the grass, and the vast Pacific stretches away on every side, dark and calm and murmuring, to a horizon lost in the gathering night. Let the great age of the giants rise once more in your mind, one last time, and then let it go softly. The green and populous island, the coast ringed with the standing ancestors, crowned in red, their coral eyes agleam, the carvers at their work on the mountainside, the giants walking upright across the land, the whole bright, teeming, sacred world of Rapa Nui in its glory, blazing at the edge of the endless sea. And let it settle and quieten and grow still, the carving ceasing, the giants lying down to their long rest in the grass, the birdman swimming his last for the sacred egg, the island passing through its sorrows and its silences, and coming at last to this quiet present, where the ancestors stand again above the shore, and the people endure, and all is still beneath the stars. Rest now at the edge of the world, in the great peace of the ocean night. There is nothing here but the soft beat of the surf, and the warm wind in the grass, and the huge and brilliant sky, and the great stone faces keeping their silent watch, as they have for 1,000 years, and will keep it still until the morning. You are as far from every care as it is possible to be, out here on the loneliest and most peaceful island in all the world. Let your breathing slow to the rhythm of the surf. Let the last of the day dissolve into the warm dark. The stars will slowly overhead, more of them than you have ever seen, ancient and calm and beautiful, the same stars that guided the first voyagers across the sea so long ago. And beneath them the giants stand, and the island sleeps, and the great ocean rocks the whole small world of Rapa Nui gently, gently toward the dawn. There is nothing left to do, and nowhere to be, and nothing to remember. The stone ancestors keep their watch. The island rests. The people sleep, safe on their far shore, the children of the voyagers, under the keeping of the stars. And the vast and gentle ocean murmurs on, all around, as it has since before there were any people at all to hear it. So let yourself drift, now, out on that great calm sea of sleep, as the giants keep their watch and the stars will slowly overhead. And so we come gently to the very end of our long journey to the loneliest island in all the world, and to the great stone ancestors who gaze, forever, out over the endless and peaceful sea. And so the great stone ancestors stand again today, raised once more upon their platforms along the shore, gazing out over the grass and the sea as they did 1,000 years ago. No longer symbols of a people who destroyed themselves, but monuments to one of the most extraordinary human achievements of all time. Think of what these islanders did. They found, across the emptiest ocean on Earth, a speck of land no one knew was there. In utter isolation, cut off from all humankind, they built a whole world. And with nothing but stone and rope and their own hands and minds, they carved 1,000 giants from a mountain and made them walk and raised them to the sky. It is one of the boldest, strangest, most astonishing things our species has ever done. And they did more than build wonders, they endured. Against the deforestation and the hardship, they adapted and survived. Against the slave ships and the plagues that came from beyond the sea and reduced them to a mere handful, they held on and did not vanish. And their descendants live on the island still, speaking the old tongue, keeping the old stories, dancing the old dances, the living children of the people who carved the Moai. The Rapa Nui are not a lost people. They are here. And the false old tale that they destroyed themselves has, in our own time, begun to give way to a truer and juster story. Not of a foolish people who ruined their world, but of a resourceful and resilient one, who did something magnificent against impossible odds, and who survived even the near extinction that others brought upon them. Their riddles, though, remain, and perhaps that is part of their gift to us. We still cannot read their strange rongo-rongo writing. We still argue over exactly how the giants were moved and why they fell. The great stone faces still keep their deepest secrets, gazing out in silence over the grass and the endless sea. And there is something fitting in that the loneliest island in the world, and the boldest voyage in human history, and the great stone ancestors at the edge of everything, should hold on still to a little of their mystery. But all of that can wait for the morning. There is nothing left for you to do tonight. The great ocean is dark and vast and murmuring now, the stone giants standing quiet beneath a sky ablaze with more stars than you have ever seen, and the long journey of this story has finally come to rest. So let your breathing slow, and let the last of the day dissolve. Sleep now and sleep deeply. The old stone ancestors will keep their quiet watch above the sea, as they have for 1,000 years, and another gentle story will be waiting for you whenever you are ready to listen again. Good night.